People often say they left without warning, but when an empath detaches, nothing about it is sudden. What appears to be an overnight disappearance is actually the final step of a long, silent, internal process, one that unfolded slowly, patiently, and painfully. Empaths are not impulsive people. They are deeply observant, emotionally intelligent, and highly self-aware. Long before they pull away, they notice small shifts, a lack of reciprocity, emotional inconsistency, dismissiveness disguised as normal behavior. They feel when their presence becomes optional and their effort becomes expected. But instead of reacting, empaths internalize. They ask themselves difficult questions. Am I being too sensitive? Am I asking for too much? Should I try harder? This is where the process begins. Not with anger, but with reflection. Because empaths value emotional harmony, they attempt to adjust rather than confront. They give more patience, more understanding, more space. They believe that if they can just explain themselves internally long enough, the other person will eventually feel what they feel. This isn't weakness. This is emotional regulation at work. From an emotional intelligence perspective, empaths possess high self-awareness and empathy, but they often delay self-protection. They tolerate emotional imbalance longer than most because they can see both sides. They can feel someone else's wounds, limitations, and fears, and they account for them. Every unreturned effort, however, is stored emotionally, not as resentment, not as rage, but as quiet data. Each moment of being overlooked adds weight. Each ignored need creates distance. Each time they choose silence instead of expression, something inside them begins to shift. The emotional bond doesn't break, it thins. And this thinning happens invisibly. Outwardly, the empath still shows up. They still respond, they still care. But internally they are recalibrating, they are slowly pulling emotional energy back toward themselves, often without realizing it at first. This is why others are so shocked when the empath finally detaches. They mistake emotional patience for emotional permanence. At a certain point, something changes. The empath stops explaining, not because they have nothing to say, but because they realize their words are no longer being heard. Emotional intelligence recognizes when communication has become inefficient, when expression leads only to further depletion. This is the moment of internal clarity. The empath understands that continuing to engage emotionally will cost them their sense of self. And unlike impulsive exits driven by anger, this realization brings calm. There is no explosion, no confrontation, no dramatic goodbye, because the decision has already been made internally. By the time the empath withdraws outwardly, the relationship has already ended inwardly. They have processed the grief privately. They have accepted the reality quietly. They have let go without needing validation. This is what makes empath detachment feel so final. It isn't fueled by emotion, it is guided by emotional intelligence. When empaths detach, they are not punishing others. They are responding to their own inner signals, signals that have been ignored for too long. They are choosing emotional balance over emotional sacrifice. And once this internal process completes, reversal becomes rare. Because the empath did not leave on impulse, they left with understanding. They didn't walk away during confusion. They walked away after clarity. So when someone says they left without warning, what they really mean is, I wasn't paying attention to the quiet signs. Empaths always give warning, just not loudly. Their silence was the warning. Their patience was the warning. Their gradual emotional distance was the warning. The detachment only appears sudden to those who never noticed the long internal journey that led to it. Empaths don't burn out because they care too much. They burn out because they care alone. Overgiving is rarely recognized in the moment it begins. It starts quietly, with extra understanding, extended patience, and emotional labor given without being asked. Empaths sense what others need before words are spoken, and they move instinctively to fill emotional gaps. This ability feels natural to them, even noble. But emotional intelligence teaches something critical. Empathy without balance becomes self-erasure. When an empath gives and gives without receiving emotional reciprocity, their nervous system stays in a constant state of emotional output. They are listening, holding space, regulating moods, and absorbing unspoken tension, while receiving little in return. Over time, this creates emotional fatigue, not resentment. The empath doesn't say, "I'm tired of you." They think, "I'm tired of feeling empty." This is the first stage of emotional burnout. Reciprocity isn't about equal effort in obvious ways. It's about emotional presence, being seen, acknowledged, and emotionally met. When empathy flows in only one direction, the empath begins to feel invisible. Their needs don't feel rejected, they feel irrelevant, and that realization is exhausting. Daniel Goleman's work on emotional intelligence highlights self-regulation as essential to emotional health. Empaths often delay this step. They override their own emotional limits because they believe understanding others is more important than protecting themselves. But the body keeps score, energy drops, motivation fades, emotional responsiveness dulls. What once felt like compassion begins to feel like obligation. The empath still shows up, but now it costs them something every time they do. This is emotional burnout, not loud, not dramatic, but deeply destabilizing. At this stage, empaths don't usually confront. They withdraw internally. They stop offering unsolicited support. They stop anticipating needs. They stop explaining themselves emotionally, not out of spite, out of self-preservation. Burnout activates emotional intelligence in a different way. The empath realizes that constant giving without return is not love. It is imbalance, and imbalance cannot be sustained without damage. This is why empath detachment often surprises people. They didn't see the burnout because the empath never complained. They assumed silence meant strength and patience meant endless capacity. But capacity has limits. Once an empath recognizes that reciprocity will not come, the emotional bond begins to dissolve. They don't argue, they don't demand, they simply step back. Because the moment an empath chooses rest over repair, the relationship has already changed. Overgiving didn't end because they stopped caring. It ended because caring without care coming back became too costly, and emotional intelligence always chooses survival over sacrifice. When empaths go silent, it is often misunderstood. Silence is mistaken for punishment, withdrawal is seen as cruelty, and distance is interpreted as revenge. But for an emotionally intelligent empath, silence is not a weapon, it is a boundary. Empaths do not leave to make a point. They leave because continuing to stay would require betraying themselves. Revenge is loud. It seeks reaction, validation, and power. A silent exit does none of those things. It does not demand attention or explanation. It simply removes emotional access. This distinction matters. Empaths communicate long before they detach. They express through patience, consistency, and presence. When these efforts are repeatedly overlooked or taken for granted, emotional intelligence recognizes that more explanation will not lead to more understanding. At that moment, silence becomes clarity. Daniel Goleman's work on emotional intelligence highlights boundaries as a form of self-regulation. A boundary is not about controlling others, it is about controlling what you allow to continue harming you. For empaths, the silent exit is the most regulated response available. There is no need to argue, no need to convince, no need to defend feelings that have already been ignored. The silent exit happens when an empath realizes that access to their emotional world has been misused. They stop offering vulnerability to those who cannot hold it with care. This is not emotional shutdown, it is emotional containment. Instead of exploding or retaliating, the empath chooses restraint. Instead of engaging in endless emotional labor, they choose peace. They withdraw not because they are cold, but because they are finally listening to themselves. Silence protects what explanation could not. Many people feel blindsided by this exit because they confuse availability with obligation. They assume the empath's presence would continue regardless of how it was treated. But emotional intelligence does not support self-abandonment. The silent exit draws a clear line. This is where my responsibility to you ends, and my responsibility to myself begins. And once that line is drawn, it is rarely crossed again. Boundaries formed quietly are often the strongest ones. They are not reactive. They are not emotional. They are the result of reflection and self-respect. When an empath leaves silently, they are not closing the door out of anger. They are closing it because they finally understand that staying open has become unsafe for their emotional health. There is no satisfaction in this exit. There is no triumph, only relief. Relief from over-explaining, relief from emotional imbalance, relief from being accessible to those who never truly showed up. This is why the silent exit feels so final. It wasn't created in a moment of emotion. It was created after emotional clarity. And once an empath chooses peace over proximity, silence becomes the most respectful boundary they can set for themselves and for everyone involved. When empaths finally detach, people often believe there is still a chance to fix things. A message sent later, an apology offered too late, or a sudden burst of attention is seen as a possible reopening. But emotional intelligence reveals a different truth. When an empath detaches, the door was closed long before the goodbye. Empaths process endings internally. They don't need conflict to understand loss. They don't need dramatic events to accept reality. Instead, they observe patterns. They notice consistency or the lack of it. And once clarity replaces hope, the emotional bond begins to dissolve quietly. This internal closure happens in stages. First comes understanding. The empath sees that effort is no longer mutual. Then comes acceptance, the recognition that potential will not become reality. Finally comes emotional release, not anger, not bitterness, just detachment. By the time others notice distance, the empath has already grieved what could have been. They have mourned privately, adjusted emotionally, and found peace within themselves. This is why reconnection feels impossible after empath detachment. It's not because the empath is unforgiving, it's because forgiveness already happened internally. Daniel Goleman's emotional intelligence framework explains this as emotional regulation at its highest level. The empath no longer reacts to the situation because they have fully processed it. Emotional neutrality replaces emotional attachment, and neutrality is irreversible. Once an empath reaches emotional neutrality, there is no emotional pull left to revive. The relationship no longer occupies mental space or emotional energy. It becomes something that was, not something that could be again. Attempts to re-enter at this stage often feel confusing to those on the outside. The empath is calm, polite, sometimes even kind, but emotionally unavailable. His is not coldness. This is completion. The empath did not close the door to hurt anyone. They closed it because staying open required constant emotional compromise, and emotional intelligence does not ask someone to sacrifice their inner stability for external attachment. When an empath detaches, it is not a phase. It is not distance for attention. It is not silence to provoke change. It is a conclusion. This is why empaths rarely return once they leave. They don't leave during chaos. They leave after clarity. And clarity, once achieved, cannot be undone by late realizations. The door is closed not in anger but in peace, and peace does not reopen doors that once led to emotional depletion. Empath detachment is final because it is conscious. It is the moment they choose emotional balance over emotional hope, and when that choice is made, the internal decision becomes permanent. What remains is not resentment, but calm distance. And that calm is the clearest sign that the door is already closed.